So I'm playing this for all of you. Imagine this. You're a 19-year-old kid, and you've been drafted, or actually volunteered, to be an Air Force pilot. Never been out of the country before. And you're flying over Germany in World War II. You're flying in an old bomber, which is a propeller plane at this point, and you've got a crew with you. And below you, on the ground, the entire ground is covered with anti-aircraft artillery. And you're trying to avoid getting hit. And at some point, you begin to hear a ruckus in the back of the plane. Your explosions. And you see that your left engine is out. In the next minute, you see that your pilot has been shot. And the right engine is out. And you're going down. And so what do? Well, there's a young man, Officer Gonzalez, whose son, Lawrence Gonzalez, writes about him in one of his books. And he said what his father did at that point is he began to realize there was no option but to go down with the plane. You're 27,000 feet above the ground. There is no chance to parachute out. He's got no equipment. He can't get out of the plane. And the plane is fundamentally cut in half at this point. There is no tail section anymore. And the plane is crashing down to earth. And somehow he finds himself able to get underneath, in essence, what is the dashboard of the plane, the front panel of the plane. And he's crushed underneath there because as the plane is spinning, the centrifugal force of the spin of the plane is driving him further and further into this position. And the next thing he knows, he's on the ground, and he's bloodied, he's bleeding. His body has been damaged in an unbelievable way. And the next thing he knows as he opens his eyes is there's a German farmer who's standing over him, pointing a gun at him, speaking in German, and he knows he's the enemy. And he's about to be shot. The German farmer pulls the trigger, and the gun misfires. And he starts to laugh. He starts to laugh because he realizes he's just fallen 27,000 feet out of the sky. And he lived. But he was about to get shot by a German farmer whose gun happens to misfire. At that point, an officer comes up and they take him into custody. They say, we can't shoot him. He's a prisoner of war. And he survives in the prisoner of war camp. They actually help him in terms of putting him together again, not particularly well. He's got broken bones in both his legs. His face has been damaged. His arms and most of his torso have broken bones in it. And yet he survives. And he goes back and he winds up being a clinician in one of the medical fields in the United States. And he has his young son, Lawrence Gonzalez. Now, imagine growing up the son of this guy. What an act to follow, right? So Lawrence decides he's got to have some of that stuff. He's not quite sure what it is, but he knows he wants it. He knows whatever it is that let his father be that guy. By the way, the only one who survived that crash, and who only got out of it by pure luck that the gun misfired, and yet made it through the concentration camp effect of being in this prisoner of war environment, and comes home and has a family, 4 kids, married, successful in his career, looked up to by many others, and continues to live his life with a sense of joy and excitement and really a zest for being alive. And he wants to know, how does he do it? What's unique about these guys? And he goes on a lifelong quest to find out. And he's written a number of books about this. Okay? Again, his name is Lawrence Gonzalez, and he writes about survival. And he studied what makes people who survive. What is the survival mind? What's different about these people? And he begins to do things himself. I mean, he's a world-class aerobatic flyer, so he can do acrobatics, you know, incredible stuff in the air. And he's climbed mountains, and he's been on excursions to the Arctic, and, you know, he's done all kinds of that kind of stuff to push himself, to find out, what am I capable of? And in this book that he writes, starting with this story about his father, he begins to talk about what's in the survivor mind. And what does it take to be different? I happen to have a program I'm attending right now at Ashridge Business School in the UK, and one of the professors there is a guy named Steve Marshall. And Steve Marshall is an ex-RAF pilot, Royal Air Force pilot. And I was talking to him about this, the survival mind, and I was using the example of Lawrence Gonzalez and explaining to him, how is, you know, this possible? He said, it's really interesting. He said, there was a situation I was in where at some point the engines failed. And I knew I was going down, and in my mind, I was screaming, you know, but I listened to the tapes, and it was, left engine's out. I think we've lost the right engine. We're beginning to try to take control. It seems we have no rudder. He said, I couldn't believe that guy was so calm. And then I realized it was me. So there's these two parts of the brain that are functioning simultaneously, is what's going on. So even as I scream at you, so to speak, something occurs. And there's a visceral response, right? You can't help it, especially if you don't expect it. And that part of your brain wants to take over when the situation is unfamiliar, when the situation is uncomfortable, when you don't know what's going on and you can't rely on the standard patterns that you put in place. You see, the reason these guys can do what they do, the reason that Lawrence Gonzalez's father and Steve Marshall can respond that way, and you hear these tapes, and they're in life and death situations, and they sound like they're sitting on a block of ice. They're so cool, right? Is because they've trained themselves to be in that situation, to understand it's not the ability to fly when everything goes right. It's the ability to fly when everything goes wrong. You know? I did a piece of study. I actually wrote a chapter of a book based upon this pilot Scully, who's another pilot in the United States who was flying the United plane that landed in the Hudson River. So again, he hits a flock of birds coming out of the airport, and they take out his engines. He's got no engines. He literally glides a 747 and lands it on the surface of the Hudson River and gets everyone out of the plane. Minimal injuries, no major injuries, no critical injuries, no deaths. You know, and you listen to the tapes are available, by the way, on YouTube. They're amazing. And you listen to the tapes and you hear him go, I think we're going to, no, he goes, we'll be down in the Hudson, or we'll be putting her down in the Hudson, something to that effect is the words he uses. And you hear the air traffic controller saying, what did he just say? Can you repeat? And the other air traffic controller goes, I think he's landing in the Hudson. And here's Scully completely chilled about landing this plane full of people in the Hudson River and manages to pull it off. Now, these are life and death situations, folks. And these people remain cool and they make great decisions. They know what to do. They've trained themselves to be capable of responding in that situation, in that moment when it's most necessary, and to do the right thing, you could say. And I walk into organizations and I work with leaders of companies and I work with leaders of teams, and the copier is broken. And life in that moment ends as far as they're concerned. Oh my God, what are we going to do? Fourth quarter projections are off by 10%. You're not flying a plane full of people when these things happen to you. But you're relying on a decision-making strategy that's built around things going right. See, if you're like most people in the world, you've organized your life for things to go right. You've tried to build organizations and contexts where things go right. You've tried to build into the organizations that you run and operate and work within predictability to know what's going to happen before it happens. And in fact, your greatest desire is to be able to know what's going to happen before it happens. And when you don't, and when you know that you cannot know what you do not know, most people enter into a state of anxiety. And they do one of three things. They either make believe the thing that they don't know doesn't exist. They just delete it. Or they make believe somehow they have a magical way of knowing the future. No, really, I'm intuitive. Or they go into panic. And they spin their wheels trying to find out, trying to create a system or gather the data or bring in an expert or whatever it may take to know what cannot be known. And what I'm here to talk to you about for the next few minutes is how do you survive in a world which is predicated on an uncertain future? The one thing that we can know is that we cannot know what will happen that hasn't happened yet. That we can know. And every time you move in any direction in the world, anytime you do anything with anyone about any possible outcome, there's no way of guaranteeing that that's what will happen. In fact, I'd argue so much about this with you as to say, if that's the way the world worked, you'd probably be in more panic. You'd probably be in a greater sense of anxiety. Most of you would find a tall building and the fastest way to the ground. Because life would be incredibly and utterly boring. Who would watch a ball game of any kind, or a Formula One race, or whatever else it might be, where you knew with absolute certainty everything that was going to happen and what the ending was like? How interesting would that season of sports be? How many of those Olympics would you show up for? Right? We love uncertainty as long as it's not ours. So anybody else's uncertainty is wonderful, right? And yet, we know that there are people who deal with uncertainty in a way that seems more competent, more capable than some other people. We see people who have a certain sense of themselves where they can walk into a situation and they're present to what's actually happening. Not what they wanted to happen, not what they imagined would happen, not what happened 2 years ago in a similar situation for them, but what's actually happening in this moment. See, that's, you could say, step one, is these people have trained themselves to remain what we call situationally aware. They're present to the data that's actually emergent right now. They don't presume that they can guess what is going to happen that hasn't yet, even though they can't help doing that. So I'll say it again. You can't help guessing what's going to happen next, even though you know you can't. If you could stop doing that, if you could stop trying to guess what was going to happen that hasn't happened yet, you could never go to a magic show again and be entertained. The whole premise of magic is the ability to make something appear out of nothing, when we all know that that's not what's happening. But the ability for the magician to lead our attention in such a way that they can get us to go to where they want us to go about what's going to happen that hasn't happened yet, and then get something else to happen, is what allows them to make sure that we don't notice what they're actually doing that we're not supposed to see. So even when I say to you, you want to remain situationally aware and present, this is part of the decision-making skill set I want to refer to, you have to understand you can't help yourself but to want to do that. And your brain will take you where it wants to go, not where you want to take it. So the fundamental distinction here is when we look at these people who are high survivors, that's one of the phrases that's used around this kind of reference, is the survival mindset or the survivor's mind. People are highly resilient. What we find is they somehow have this ability to disregard the data that's present for them about what they want to be happening or what they hoped would happen or what they imagined would happen and attend to what's happening instead. Right? I could not have set up a better preview for my conversation than the failure of PowerPoint in the presentation just before mine. There was no plan for that. I wish we had been so clever as to design that in so I could talk about it now. But we didn't. And you watch what's going on in the room, and you watch people, whether it's the people in the audience sitting back here and trying to figure out what's going to happen next, when are they going to get this resolved? Oh my God, I can't believe this is going on. Why didn't they plan better? They should have had 2 machines. I can't believe this is going on right now. Wasting my time. Or the people trying to resolve it by playing with the computer, right? Or the dance you were doing up here, trying to figure out what's going on, or Pele playing some, hypnotic music for us, or whatever it might be, right? But each of those things required somebody in a moment that was unplanned to be making decisions. And how do you resolve it? What are you going to do? And how long is the gap between the reality that you're experiencing and the reality that you imagined for you to catch up with what's actually happening? You get that? That's the gap in which the non-survivors die. That's where it falls apart, is the inability to adapt to the present situation that's unfolding, regardless of the fact that it wasn't the one that you imagined or hoped for. But to be able to instantly reset yourself to this moment. See, now what happens if you read all of these wonderful books about success and achievement and the secret and so on and so on and so on and so on and so forth, what you're going to read are, in essence, treatises that are neurological or neuroscientific in a premise, whether or not they say that. Doesn't matter if they ever use that language or those words, but they're neurologically premised with the idea that you can run your experience from what's called the top down, from the cortical process, the front of your brain where decisions are made and thinking happens that you understand and have access to and can manipulate. All the wonderful things that we can do as humans to change and operate in this space of abstract consideration and design, somehow or another, all of these books and these trainings and the things that we want to get into suggest to us somehow that we can get the lower parts of our brain, the animal parts of our brain that are hundreds of thousands, millions of years older in evolutionary form, to accept that direction of input. And yet when we look at the real world, when we actually study what's going on, and we understand what's happening, in the moment that it's happening, the older the brain part that we're looking at is, the more control it has over the overall system. Unless you've adjusted those pathways before the event. See, those pilots, it wasn't the first time that they experienced the idea of failure while flying. That's not when it happened to them for the first time. They trained and trained and trained over again to direct those cortical pathways so that in that moment where utter and absolute fear took over, the part of the brain that goes, check the rudders. Are the engines functioning? Goes into play. Because they trained it to do that. You get it? But the other part of that brain is still screaming. Screaming like a madman. And maybe that's what they hear in their head. But they've trained the neuromuscular system, what they do with their body, to ignore that screaming, that incredible angst of information that's rushing up from the lower primal parts of the brain to try to take over, to instead respond to the frontal part of the brain, the cortical part of the brain that says, move your hands in this way. Push your feet and see if you have control of the flaps. You get it? By thousands and thousands of repetitions of training that cortical process. Now, here's the challenge that I offer you, is if you're operating in a normal organizational setting, things are just not that simple. See, as sophisticated as it is, operating a 747 is incredibly simpler than having a conversation with someone. Because that 747, when you push the yoke forward, either does what it's supposed to do or it doesn't. There's no option. It works or it doesn't work, right? I have no idea what she's going to do when I say hello. I have no idea what happened to her this morning and how the drive in for her was, or whether she's upset because she ate something at lunch or thrilled because she had a great dessert. I don't know what went on for her before I say hello. And all of that is going to show up in the moment that she begins responding to whatever I put out. And then she does something. I say hello, she goes, Joseph. And now that's part of the loop, right? Or I go, hello, and she goes, what do you want? And now that's part of the loop. And my front brain is able to go, it has nothing to do with me. It was a bad pickle at lunch, as Charles Dickens would say. But that part of my brain which responds to another person, another human being, is having all kinds of responses. That screaming begins in my head. Or depending, maybe if it was the first response, the screaming begins way lower down for me. But somehow or another, I'm going to respond to what's happening. And I'm going to respond in at least those two different ways. In the way that I have access to in manipulating those abstract symbols, what I call my thinking. And I'm going to have all this other stuff that's going on that has such power over how I even hear or see or notice what she does next. And while that's happening, I'm still trying to process, what do I do? Way more complex than a 747. Now put me into a room with 8 other people and call it a meeting. Oh my God. How overwhelming is that? And unless I train myself to be aware of all this before the effect, before the event where it's happening, there's no way I can manage it. And especially if I happen to be the person leading the meeting. If I happen to be the person whose meeting it is. Now I feel a certain sense of obligation. The meeting's kind of resting on my shoulders to succeed, and I've got to manage all these people, and I don't know what they're going to do. In fact, they're not doing what I hoped and wished they would. Somebody brought up an objection from 1968, when the company tried this thing before, and it didn't work. Before there were frickin' computers, right? And now I've got to deal with this. So there's all of these dynamics happening, and they're all flowing and unfolding very rapidly, and I'm trying to keep up. I'm trying to maintain a sense of myself in the presence of this. But I've never trained myself to have a sense of myself. In fact, all I know about the world is how to respond to the stimulus that shows up. So this happens, and that happens, this other thing I don't. And I just know how bang, 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 and I respond. How do I know that people do that? Guaranteed, if one of you right now felt your phone buzzing in your pocket or it ringing next to you, you'd immediately try to do something to correct it. To overcome that response would take an effort on your part to let it just go. For most of you. I don't know each of you personally, but for most of you. Unless you've trained yourself to have that response when the phone rings in your pocket and you didn't expect it to be on. And I watch this in meetings where they're discussing $200 million deals that will make or break the company this year. And the phone rings and someone feels an urgent need to answer it. How insane is that? And they don't even know they're answering it. It's not like they're answering it because they went, I have to answer this phone. They're responding to this external stimulus because they've never trained themselves to be present to themselves, having the experience they're having. And this is the fundamental basis of the work that we've begun to do. We've begun to look at how do you train that part of the brain which you don't know is operating when it's operating. How do you train that part of the brain where you have no conscious, ordinary access to it? But you recognize has to be operating when all these other things are operating. I know when I say hello to her that whatever facial expression she makes has a meaning to it. I don't know how I know that. Not because I've studied it, not because I've looked at the maps of facial expression and coding and all that, but because I'm a human being. I know when she makes a certain expression, there's a certain intentionality behind it in 99.99% of the cases where I've seen that expression. And I know, by the way, because I'm human, whether it's sincere or put on. And that part of the brain is now telling me what to do next, how I should feel about what you've done, which tells me what I say to you, which then creates another feeling in you, and this keeps going on and on and on. And we play and engage in this chess game that most of us don't even realize we're playing all the time. And then when it doesn't work, we're frustrated, we're upset. So now you walk in and you're the leader of this meeting. And there's all these subtle, silent signals that are going on. And the question I'm really asking you is, do you have access to that part of the brain which manages and operates in that silent space? And the way that you do this is you begin to pay attention to what's happening in that silent space when you don't need to. This is what the pilots do. They get in this thing called a simulator, and they make believe they're crashing. And they have to be really careful, by the way, when they do this. Because if you don't do it really well, at the end of the simulator, what we found is there was an old thing that would happen. They would finish the simulation, and it was kind of fun to let the plane crash. It started showing up when they were flying planes. They would get to a certain point in the process, and they responded like they were in the simulators. So I'll tell you two more stories, and then we'll kind of close it up. We look at these young pilots who are training to do one of the most amazing things in human performance that I can imagine. Landing on an aircraft carrier in the ocean, while it's in motion, the ocean is in motion, and it's at night, and you can't see clearly what's going on. So you're going to land this plane on the deck of an aircraft carrier. Now, you've got information coming in. You've got your air traffic controller giving you information about wind speed, wind direction, the angle of the deck, the movement of the ocean, the swell size. You've got all this information coming in. And most of the time, thank God, it works. Most pilots land the plane. By the time they give them permission to land the plane and do their test runs, they've already proven themselves as being very, very likely to be able to accomplish this. But every once in a while, it goes wrong. And here's what happens more often than we'd like to admit. A pilot's coming in for a landing, and they're coming in to the bow of the ship, or they're coming into the tail of the ship. And what's happening, depending on the wind speed and direction and all of that, is that the ship is in motion, as I said, and it may be rising and falling. And in order to get in, all their brain thinks in that moment, think about this, you're coming in, it's the first time you've ever done this, it's at night, and you're probably at least a little bit afraid. Or that part of your brain that you don't have much control over, it's not happy. But it knows something. What does it know? It knows that landing on the deck of that ship means safety. Means you're okay. So your whole brain now, that you're not in control of, is telling you, do whatever it takes to land safely on the deck of that ship. Because at that point, this terror I'm experiencing is over. You get that? We want out. And the ship rises, and the air traffic controller is saying, listen, you've got to change your angle of approach or pull out. But the pilot is now hell-bent on landing the plane because that's where safety is. Everything in our evolution tells us, be safe, survive. And survival here means get the plane on the deck of the ship. And every once in a while, a plane will hit the back of the ship and literally slice off the top of the plane. Fortunately, sometimes, so effectively, that the top of the plane skitters across the deck and comes to a stop, and they get the pilot and the navigator out. And they'll ask the pilot, what the hell were you thinking? We told you to pull out. Your navigator was going, pull up, pull up, pull up. And you kept going. And the pilots say this, I know. I knew I couldn't land the plane. And that's where, as we say in English, rubber meets the road, is when you can translate what you intend, what you want, into the actions or behaviors that create the results that you want. And it requires that you can update what's happening against what you hoped and wanted and wished and thought would happen and make the adjustment. As we look at this, what we find is the most effective people on the planet at doing this are about 5 to 6 years old. You can put them in situations where you perturbate the environment. You change the environment on them. You change the rules. And they just play whatever game is now in place. In fact, they're really good at changing the rules themselves and inventing new games as they're playing a game they know how to play to make it a new one. Do that with adults, makes them crazy. How do I know? Because it's how I design every one of my trainings. I set up a set of rules for you. You come in and I go, here's what we're going to do. Here's what your response is. Here's what I want as an outcome. And halfway through the exercise, I go, and now we'll do something else. By the way, you can't talk. And I've even had professionals come in and observe my trainings and go, you can't do that to people. And I go, why? He goes, because it upsets them. And I go, better to be upset in the training room with me than out there in the world where it counts. Better to figure out how to make the adaptations, and adjustments with me here in a controlled environment where I'm doing it with intention to lead you to go to parts of the brain that you don't want to go to and don't normally have access to, or better when it really counts and the outcome makes a difference in your life. Or is it better to be upset? So I have no problem upsetting you. 5 and 6-year-olds do a really good job. 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds, they actually want you to follow the rules. And if you have children or been around children, you understand this. If you do something that's not what the rules, they'll tell you, that's not what the rules said. It's not how my teacher said that you do addition, Dad. My teacher says, and all of a sudden the world changes for them, and they can't adapt from that point forward as successfully as they could the year before. And unless they go into some significant training, some significant performance practice, which allows them to begin to build adaptability, the ability to have freedom in their actions, their behaviors, what they do, how they respond to people, how they experience themselves, they lose it forever. Last story. Hugh Jackman, the actor, tells this great story. He's on Broadway, and he's playing Garçon in the play Beauty and the Beast, you know, the evil guy who wants to take Belle away. And there's this scene where he picks Belle up and he holds her over his head and he's singing, and he has to hit a particular note, the high F note is what he says. And the way I heard him tell the story is at that point he was doing something different. I forget if it was a new diet he was on, or he was on some kind of medication, or he had taken some supplements or whatever it was. But it required that he drank 2 liters of water before he went on stage. There was a timing thing. And he said, I always drink, you know, to make sure I'm hydrated when I'm on stage, and I always use the toilet just before I go on stage. So I did that. But I had never drunk 2 liters of water just before I went on stage. And he said, they called me, and literally they're waiting for me to walk out on stage, and I realize I have to pee. And he goes, what do I do? And so he walks out on stage, and they do the act, and he gets this point, and he picks Belle up, and he says, at this point, I can just feel it. He goes, I know if I hit this note, it's all coming out. So what do? I either ruin the scene and don't hit the note, or I let go. He goes, at that moment I found out that the muscles you contract to hit a high F are exactly opposite to the ones you relax when you pee. And there I am, and it's all coming out on stage. And so the person who's interviewing at this point, and you know, he's telling the story to, says, so what was it like? He goes, it was the most embarrassing moment in my life, but the show must go on. So be prepared for what it is you cannot possibly expect to happen. And in that moment, when you realize in your mind, you're screaming to yourself, on the outside, don't let him see you sweat. The only way you can do that is you got to practice in the hot seat. so long that you can handle the heat. And if and when you're ready for that, you've been to a great introduction to it. You've heard some good stories and tales and programming from some people up here. But in my opinion, one of the best in the world at doing it sits over there, a guy named Henrik Reno and his team. And so we invite you to be part of it when you're ready, if you're ready, or to come back again next time we do this, and I'll tell you some more stories. Thank you. Thank you.